Thomas Mitchell thought he was bidding on a worthless pile of stone when he raised his hand for that crumbling cathedral, but what lay hidden beneath its altar would reveal a fortune so vast and a secret so profound that it would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the forgotten town of Millbrook forever. Before we explore this incredible journey, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning mist clung to the Gothic spires like ghosts refusing to let go. Thomas Mitchell stood in the overgrown cemetery beside Sacred Heart Cathedral, his calloused hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. At 42, he looked older. Grief had carved lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago when Sarah was still alive. The twins, Emma and Grace, just turned 16, barely spoke to him anymore, not out of anger, but out of a shared sadness so deep that words felt inadequate. Thomas had been a different man when Sarah was alive, confident, quick with a joke, the kind of father who built elaborate Halloween costumes and never missed a parent-teacher conference. But cancer had stolen more than just his wife. It had taken his sense of purpose, his ability to see beyond the next bill, the next meal, the next day of simply surviving. The girls had retreated into themselves after the funeral. Emma, once vibrant and talkative, now spent most of her time sketching in a journal she never let anyone see. Grace, who used to fill the house with laughter and music, had grown quiet, moving through their small rental house like a shadow of her former self. Thomas knew they were all drowning in different ways, but he didn't know how to throw them a lifeline when he was barely keeping his own head above water. The insurance money had run out 8 months ago. The medical bills kept coming like punches to an already broken man. Thomas worked construction when he could find it, but jobs were scarce in Millbrook. The old steel mill that had sustained the town for 3 generations had closed 5 years back, taking most of the decent-paying work with it. Now the place felt like a town slowly dying, full of empty storefronts and for sale signs that never came down. That morning, Thomas had driven past the auction signs posted around town without much interest. Estate sales and foreclosure auctions had become common in Millbrook, people selling what they could before moving away to find work in bigger cities. But something about this particular sale had caught his attention. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of auctioning off an entire cathedral. Maybe it was desperation dressed up as curiosity. The auctioneer's voice crackled through a portable speaker system that had seen better decades. He was a thin man in an ill-fitting suit, the kind of person who made his living picking through the remnants of other people's dreams. Next item, Lot 47, Sacred Heart Cathedral, built 1896, condemned by the city last year due to structural concerns and unpaid taxes. Opening bid set at $5,000. Thomas looked around at the sparse crowd. About 30 people had shown up for the auction, mostly bargain hunters and curiosity seekers. A few antique dealers poked through boxes of donated church items, hymnals with torn covers, brass candlesticks tarnished black with age, folding chairs that had seen better days. But nobody seemed interested in the cathedral itself. Sacred Heart loomed behind the auctioneer like something from a Gothic novel. The building was massive, its stone walls rising nearly 60 feet from the ground to the base of the bell tower. Stained glass windows, their colors muted by decades of grime and neglect, stretched toward heaven in pointed arches that spoke of medieval craftsmanship. The front steps had buckled in places, and ivy had claimed much of the south wall, but the basic structure looked solid. Thomas had driven past this building hundreds of times over the years, but he'd never really looked at it. Now, standing in the morning light with nothing left to lose, he found himself studying the stonework with a contractor's eye. The foundation appeared sound. The walls showed no obvious signs of structural failure. Yes, it needed work, probably a lot of work, but it wasn't the hopeless ruin the city inspector's report had made it out to be. No bids at $5,000. The auctioneer's voice carried a note of resignation. Let's try $3,000. Silence stretched across the small crowd. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store shifted uncomfortably and avoided eye contact with the auctioneer. Jake Morrison, a laid-off steelworker Thomas knew from the unemployment office, shook his head and wandered over to examine a box of old church bulletins. How about $1,000? The auctioneer tried again, his enthusiasm clearly waning. Someone give me $1,000 for this historic property. Thomas found himself studying the building more carefully. The Gothic Revival architecture was impressive, clearly the work of someone who understood both beauty and engineering. The bell tower, alone, must have required enormous skill and resources to build. Even in its current state, Sacred Heart Cathedral was a monument to faith, craftsmanship, and community spirit. All right, let's be realistic here, the auctioneer said with a sigh. How about $100? Surely someone can see the potential in a building like this. Still no takers. Thomas understood why. Who wanted to take on the responsibility of maintaining a structure this size? The heating bills alone would bankrupt most families. The insurance costs would be astronomical. The city had condemned it for good reason. Bringing it up to code would require a massive investment that few people in Millbrook could afford. But as Thomas stood there in the cool morning air, watching the auctioneer's growing frustration, something stirred in his chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. A sense that maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity disguised as a problem. He'd been drifting for 2 years, working odd jobs and watching his daughters slip away from him a little more each day. Maybe they all needed a project, something bigger than themselves, something that required them to work together toward a common goal. $10. The auctioneer called out desperately. Someone give me $10 for Sacred Heart Cathedral. The crowd had thinned considerably. Most people had wandered off to examine other auction items, or simply given up and gone home. The few remaining bidders looked embarrassed, as if witnessing the public humiliation of a once grand building. How about $5? The auctioneer's voice cracked slightly. $5 for a piece of Millbrook history. Thomas thought about his bank account. After paying rent, utilities, and groceries, he had maybe $300 to his name. Not enough for a real fresh start, but enough for a foolish gesture that might turn into something more. $1, the auctioneer said finally, his voice barely audible over the morning wind. Someone give me $1 for this cathedral. $1 for a building that took 5 years and the donations of an entire community to construct. Thomas's hand went up before his brain could override the impulse. $1 bid, the auctioneer said, suddenly animated again. Do I hear 2? The crowd turned to stare at Thomas. He felt heat rise in his cheeks but kept his hand raised. Mrs. Henderson shook her head like he'd lost his mind. Jake Morrison looked at him with something between admiration and pity. Going once for $1, the auctioneer continued when no other bids materialized. Going twice. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. What was he doing? He didn't know the first thing about maintaining a cathedral. He barely knew how to maintain his own life these days. Sold to bidder 23 for $1. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the cathedral's stone walls. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what had just happened. He owned a cathedral, an actual cathedral, with flying buttresses and stained glass windows, and a bell tower that stretched toward the clouds. The registration process felt like a dream. Thomas signed papers with trembling hands, wrote a check for $1 plus $37 in fees and taxes, and accepted a ring of old-fashioned skeleton keys from the clerk. "You sure about this?" she asked, looking at him with genuine concern. The structural engineer recommended demolition. The heating system hasn't worked in 15 years. And the city's going to expect you to bring everything up to current building codes if you want to use it for anything. Thomas pocketed the keys and nodded. "Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith." She shrugged and stamped his paperwork. "Well, congratulations. You're now the proud owner of Sacred Heart Cathedral. God help you." Thomas drove home in a daze. The deed to Sacred Heart Cathedral sitting on the passenger seat, like evidence of a crime he couldn't quite remember committing. The girls were at school, which gave him a few hours to figure out how to explain to his 16-year-old daughters that their father had just purchased a condemned cathedral with money they couldn't afford to spend. The house felt different when he walked in. Smaller, somehow. The peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling that he'd grown accustomed to now seemed almost quaint compared to the Gothic grandeur he'd just acquired. Thomas sat at the kitchen table and stared at the deed, reading and rereading the legal description of his new property. Sacred Heart Cathedral, built in 1896, sat on 3.5 acres of land on the hill overlooking Millbrook's old downtown district. The building itself was approximately 12,000 square feet, with a main sanctuary, bell tower, attached rectory, and various outbuildings. The deed noted that the property included all fixtures, furnishings, and improvements, though Thomas suspected there wasn't much left inside worth claiming. When Emma and Grace got home from school that afternoon, they found their father sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, a strange expression on his face. "Dad?" Emma asked cautiously. "You look weird. Did something happen?" Thomas looked up at his daughters. These two remarkable young women who looked so much like their mother, it sometimes took his breath away. Emma had inherited Sarah's artistic eye and gentle nature. Grace had gotten her mother's fierce intelligence and stubborn streak. Both girls had been forced to grow up too fast, and Thomas knew he hadn't been the father they needed these past 2 years. "I bought something today," he said finally. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Please tell me it wasn't another broken motorcycle you think you can fix." Thomas laughed, surprising himself. It was the first time he'd felt genuine amusement in months. "No, not a motorcycle." "What then?" Emma asked, settling into the chair across from him. Thomas held up the deed. "I bought Sacred Heart Cathedral." The girls stared at him in silence for several long moments. "The big stone church on the hill?" Grace asked slowly. "The one with the broken windows and the condemned sign," Emma added. "That's the one," Thomas confirmed. "Dad," Grace said carefully, "how much did it cost?" $1, Emma blinked. $1? For a whole cathedral? Plus fees and taxes, Thomas admitted. $38 total. Total fees, that's the force. The girls looked at each other, then back at their father. "Why?" Emma asked simply. Thomas set down the deed and leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I have no idea. I saw it sitting there, falling apart, abandoned, and I thought, maybe we could fix it. Maybe we need something to work on together. Something bigger than ourselves." Grace frowned. "Dad, we don't know anything about fixing churches. I don't know anything about being a widowed father either," Thomas replied. "But I'm figuring it out as I go." Emma reached across the table and touched his hand. "Can we see it? Our cathedral?" Thomas smiled. "Let's go take a look at what we bought." The drive to Sacred Heart Cathedral took 15 minutes through the winding streets of Millbrook. The building looked even more imposing in the late afternoon light, its stone walls golden with sunset. Thomas parked in what had once been the main courtyard, now cracked and overgrown with weeds. "It's huge," Grace said softly as they climbed out of the truck. "It's beautiful," Emma added, her artist's eye picking out details Thomas had missed. "Look at the stonework around the windows. And those flying buttresses, they're like stone arms holding the whole building up." Thomas approached the massive front doors with the ring of keys the clerk had given him. The doors themselves were works of art, heavy oak planks bound with iron and carved with religious symbols. The lock was original to the building, a large brass mechanism that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. The third key fit. The lock turned with a satisfying click that seemed to echo through the empty courtyard. Thomas pushed against the heavy doors, and they swung open with a groan that spoke of decades of disuse. The interior took their breath away. The sanctuary was vast, with soaring ceilings that seemed to stretch toward heaven itself. Afternoon light streamed through stained glass windows, painting the empty pews in blues and reds and gold. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax, and something indefinable that might have been accumulated prayers. "My God," Emma whispered, then immediately apologized for swearing in a church. Grace was already walking down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "Dad, this place is incredible. How could they just abandon it?" Thomas followed his daughters into the sanctuary, craning his neck to examine the vaulted ceiling. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every arch, every column, every carved detail spoke of artisans who had understood both beauty and engineering. This wasn't just a building. It was a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture. They spent the next hour exploring. The sanctuary was just the beginning. Behind the altar, they found a sacristy filled with empty cabinets and dust-covered furniture. A narrow staircase led up to the choir loft, where sheet music still lay scattered across music stands like frozen songs waiting to be sung. "Dad, look at this," Emma called from near the altar. Thomas and Grace joined her at the base of the massive stone structure that dominated the front of the sanctuary. The altar was carved from white marble and decorated with intricate Gothic tracery. But as Emma pointed out, something was off about one section. "See this panel here," she said, running her hand along the carved stone. "The pattern doesn't match the rest. It's simpler, almost plain by comparison." Thomas knelt beside her and examined the panel more closely. She was right. While the rest of the altar featured elaborate designs with flowing lines and delicate details, this one section was different. The carving was still skillful, but it lacked the complexity of the surrounding work. "Maybe it was repaired at some point," Thomas suggested. "Or replaced." Grace joined them on the other side of the altar. "But look at this," she said. "There's no mortar along the edges of this panel. All the other joints are sealed. But this one," she pressed against the stone, and it moved slightly. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "Step back, girls." He examined the panel more carefully, running his fingers along its edges. Grace was right, there was no mortar, no cement, nothing holding this section in place except its own weight and some kind of hidden mechanism. "It's not part of the original construction," he realized. "Someone added this later. But why?" Emma pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight app. In the bright LED beam, they could see hairline gaps around the entire panel, invisible in normal lighting, but clearly present when illuminated directly. "Dad," Grace said quietly, "I think this thing is supposed to move." Thomas stood and looked around the empty sanctuary. They were alone, the cathedral holding its secrets in silence. Whatever lay behind this panel had been hidden for years, maybe decades. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to disguise it, to make it look like part of the original altar. "Should we?" Emma started, then trailed off. Thomas thought about it. This was his cathedral now, legally and morally. If there was something hidden here, he had every right to investigate. But there was also something about the deliberate nature of the concealment that gave him pause. Someone had wanted this panel to remain secret. Maybe they had good reason. On the other hand, secrets had a way of festering in darkness, and Thomas had learned over the past 2 years that avoiding difficult truths rarely made them go away. "Let's see if we can figure out how it opens," he decided. They examined the panel from every angle, looking for hidden switches, pressure points, or mechanical controls. The carving showed a simple cross surrounded by geometric patterns, but nothing that looked like it was meant to be manipulated. It was Grace who noticed the small hole near the bottom of the panel, almost hidden in the shadow of a carved stone leaf. "Dad, look. This looks like a keyhole." Thomas knelt and peered at the tiny opening. It was indeed a keyhole, but unlike any he'd ever seen, ancient-looking, with intricate metalwork around its edges. He pulled out the ring of keys the clerk had given him. Most were modern duplicates for the front doors and various rooms throughout the cathedral. But there were 3 older keys on the ring, heavy iron pieces that looked original to the building. The 3rd key slid into the hidden lock like it had been waiting 90 years for this moment. Thomas turned it slowly, feeling the resistance of old metal against old metal. Something deep inside. The panel clicked, then clicked again. The sound echoed strangely, as if it was coming from a much larger space than the altar should have contained. The panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "What the hell?" Thomas breathed. Then, immediately, apologized for his language. Emma was already reaching for her phone's flashlight again. "Dad, we have to see where this goes." "Absolutely not," Thomas said automatically. "We don't know if it's safe. Could be a structural void. Could be unstable. Could be treasure," Grace said, with a grin that reminded him so much of Sarah it made his chest ache. Thomas peered into the opening. The narrow passage seemed to extend back into the altar for several feet, before opening into a larger space. The air that flowed out was cool and dry, carrying a scent he couldn't quite identify. Not musty like he would expect from a long sealed space, but clean somehow, preserved. "We should call someone," Emma said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The police, maybe, or a historian." "Call them and tell them what?" Grace asked. "That we found a secret passage in our cathedral. They'd think we were crazy." Thomas made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Stay close," he told his daughters. "If anything feels unsafe, we back out immediately." He squeezed through the opening first, Emma's phone providing light from behind. The passage was tight, but not claustrophobic, clearly designed for human access. After about 6 feet, it opened into a stone staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The stairs were worn smooth by age but solid. They descended for what felt like 2 full stories, far below the main floor of the cathedral. With each step, Thomas felt like they were traveling not just down, but back in time. At the bottom, his borrowed light revealed a heavy wooden door bound with iron. Unlike everything else they had encountered, This door looked recently maintained. The wood was oiled, the hinges moved freely, and the iron showed no signs of rust. A brass nameplate was mounted at eye level, tarnished but readable. Father Marcus Aurelius, Guardian of Sacred Treasures, Anno Domini, 1943. Thomas stared at the nameplate for a long moment. 1943. The middle of World War II. What had been happening here during those dark years? What kind of treasures had Father Marcus been guarding? "Dad?" Emma whispered from behind him. "Are you going to open it?" Thomas reached for the handle, then paused. Whatever lay beyond this door had been sealed away for almost 80 years. Someone, Father Marcus, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden. Maybe there were good reasons for that secrecy. On the other hand, Thomas now owned this building and everything in it. If Father Marcus had left something here, it was his responsibility to discover what it was and decide what to do about it. His hand trembled slightly as he grasped the iron handle. Not from fear, but from anticipation. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly alive, truly present in the moment. The handle turned easily, as if the door had been waiting for him. What Thomas and his daughters discovered beyond that door would challenge everything they thought they knew about their little town, about faith, about the lengths people would go to preserve what they held sacred. Hidden in the depths beneath Sacred Heart Cathedral was a secret that had been protected for generations, a treasure so valuable and so carefully preserved that it would transform not just their lives, but the entire community of Millbrook. But as the door swung open and light spilled into the chamber beyond, revealing wonders that belonged in the world's greatest museums, Thomas realized that finding treasure was the easy part. The real challenge would be deciding what to do with it, and whether he was worthy of the trust that Father Marcus had placed in whoever would eventually find this place. The story of Sacred Heart Cathedral was just beginning. The door opened onto a wonder that defied every expectation Thomas had built in his mind during the long descent into darkness. What lay beyond wasn't a crude cellar or forgotten storage room, but a carefully designed vault with vaulted stone ceilings and walls lined with what appeared to be climate-controlled display cases. Soft LED lighting, clearly a modern addition, illuminated the space with a warm, museum-quality glow that seemed to make the very air shimmer with reverence. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible in the sacred stillness. Thomas stepped into the chamber, his daughters close behind, all three of them moving like people entering a dream. The space was larger than the entire first floor of their rental house, with stone pillars supporting graceful arches that spoke of medieval engineering. But it was what filled the display cases that stole their breath and stopped their hearts. Manuscripts bound in leather and gold leaf caught the light like captured starfire. Chalices gleamed with precious metals and gems that seemed to pulse with their own inner radiance. Paintings in ornate frames lined the walls, their subjects gazing down with expressions of timeless peace and infinite sorrow. Sculptures, carved from marble and jade, stood on pedestals like silent sentinels, guarding secrets too precious for the ordinary world. Ancient coins were arranged in careful rows beneath glass, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of faithful hands. Religious artifacts that looked like they belonged in the Vatican's most sacred chambers reflected the gentle lighting with an otherworldly glow. Everything was pristine, perfectly preserved, as if time itself had stopped at the threshold of this hidden sanctuary. Thomas walked deeper into the vault, his work boots echoing softly against stone floors that had been polished to a mirror shine. Each step revealed new wonders, new impossibilities, a golden crucifix that seemed to float above its display stand, An illuminated prayer book open to a page decorated with miniature paintings, so detailed they looked like windows into heaven itself. A crown that sparkled with diamonds and rubies, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it wasn't just the obvious wealth that overwhelmed them. It was the care with which everything had been arranged, the love evident in every placement, every angle, every carefully written placard that accompanied each piece. Someone had spent decades creating this space, curating this collection, protecting these treasures with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. Grace stopped in front of a display case containing what appeared to be an ancient chalice. The placard beside it, written in precise handwriting, read, "Chalice of Pope Urban II, gifted to Sacred Heart during the Third Crusade, protected during the Reformation, authenticated by Cardinal Bertoli, Vatican Archives, 1938. Estimated value, immeasurable." "Dad," she said softly, "look at this date, 1938. Someone was cataloging these things right before World War II. Emma had found something equally astonishing. This manuscript. It says it's from the Gospel of St. Matthew, circa 1200. It was preserved from the bombing of Monte Cassino Abbey." She looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. "Dad, Monte Cassino was destroyed by Allied bombing in 1944. Someone saved this before it could be lost forever." Thomas continued deeper into the vault, his mind struggling to process what they were seeing. Each placard told a story of preservation, of someone who had risked everything to save these sacred objects from war, persecution, or simple neglect. This wasn't a treasure hoard or a private collection. This was the life's work of someone who understood that some things were too precious to let the world destroy. At the center of the vault stood a reading desk made of dark wood that gleamed like black glass under the gentle lighting. On it lay an open journal, its pages filled with the same precise handwriting as the placards. Thomas approached it carefully, as if it might dissolve at his touch. The journal was thick, easily 300 pages, and it appeared to chronicle decades of work. The earliest entries were dated 1938, written in black ink that had faded to a rich brown with age. The most recent entry bore yesterday's date, written in blue, ballpoint pen with a hand that shook with great age. Thomas read the final entry aloud, his voice cracking with emotion. "My time grows short, and I have found no worthy successor. The young priests today lack the understanding, the commitment necessary to guard these sacred treasures. They see only artifacts where they should see faith made manifest. I have prayed for guidance, and I believe now that I must trust in providence. Someone will find this place when the time is right. Someone who understands that they are being called to something greater than themselves. To whoever discovers this collection, you are now the guardian of more than objects. You are the keeper of faith preserved, of beauty protected against the darkness of the world. Use this gift wisely, for it was bought with blood and prayers, and the sacrifice of countless faithful souls. Father Marcus Aurelius, last guardian of the sacred trust." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system and the sound of Emma quietly weeping. "He was still alive," Grace whispered. "Until yesterday, Father Marcus was still taking care of all this." Thomas felt his knees go weak. He gripped the edge of the reading desk for support, staring down at words that had been written less than 24 hours ago. Somewhere in this town, an old priest had spent his final day tending to this collection, maintaining the sacred trust that had consumed his entire adult life. "We have to find him," Emma said urgently. "He must live nearby. Maybe he's in a nursing home. Or, Emma, Thomas said gently, look at the date on this entry. Look at the handwriting. I think Father Marcus may have passed away yesterday. Maybe that's why we found this place today. Maybe he was waiting. The weight of that possibility settled over them like a shroud. Had they been guided here by something beyond chance? Had Father Marcus somehow known that his time was ending, that his long vigil was finally over? Thomas turned the page, reading backward through decades of entries. The story that emerged was extraordinary. Father Marcus had come to Millbrook in 1938, fleeing Nazi-occupied Austria as part of a secret network of Catholic priests and scholars who were smuggling religious artifacts out of harm's way. Some pieces went to the Vatican. Others were hidden in remote monasteries, but the most precious items, artifacts whose loss would be irreplaceable, were scattered among trusted guardians in unlikely locations around the world. Sacred Heart Cathedral, in the forgotten American town of Millbrook, had been chosen as one of those hiding places. Listen to this, Thomas said, reading from an entry dated December 1941. The Chalice of Urban arrived today via the Underground Railroad. Brother Wolfgang died protecting it during his escape from Munich, but he succeeded in preserving it for future generations. I have prepared a place for it in the vault, alongside the illuminated Gospels and the crown of Wenceslaus. Each piece that arrives here represents not just immense material value, but the faith and sacrifice of those who risked everything to keep beauty alive in a world gone mad with destruction. Grace was examining another display case, this one containing what appeared to be an ancient crown made of gold and encrusted with precious stones. Dad, this placard. It says, "This is the crown of King Wenceslaus, the fourth Holy Roman Emperor. It was donated to the church during his exile and valued by papal assessors in 1943 at £2.8 million sterling. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. £2.8 million in 1943, Dad, Emma said from across the room. If that was its value 80 years ago, what would it be worth today? Thomas looked around the vault again, this time trying to count the pieces on display. There had to be at least 50 major artifacts visible, and he could see additional storage areas extending deeper into the hillside. If each piece was worth millions, if even a fraction of these items were authentic, we're not just looking at a collection, he said quietly. We're looking at one of the greatest treasures in human history. What happens next will turn this family's world completely upside down, reveal secrets that powerful people have killed to protect, and force a simple widowed father to make decisions that could change not just his life, but the fate of priceless artifacts that belong to all humanity. Stay tuned to see how Thomas and his daughters navigate the dangerous waters ahead. If you're enjoying this incredible story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Thomas spent the rest of that first day reading through Father Marcus's journal, while Emma and Grace explored the vault, photographing everything with their phones and reading as many placards as they could manage. The scope of the collection was staggering. Religious artifacts spanning 2,000 years of Christian history, illuminated manuscripts that scholars had believed lost forever, sculptures and paintings that belonged in the world's greatest museums. But more than the individual pieces, it was the story behind them that left Thomas speechless. Father Marcus hadn't just collected these treasures randomly. Each piece had been rescued from war, persecution, or neglect. Each item represented someone's desperate attempt to preserve beauty and faith in the face of unthinkable darkness. The Byzantine icon of the Virgin and Child had been smuggled out of Constantinople during the final Turkish siege in 1453. The Lindisfarne Psalter had been saved from Viking raiders by monks who died defending their monastery. The reliquary of St. Augustine had survived the destruction of Hippo, the sack of Rome, the burning of libraries during the Dark Ages, and the anti-religious fury of the French Revolution. Someone has been protecting these things for centuries, Thomas realized as he read entry after entry. Not just Father Marcus. There's been a whole network of guardians, passing the responsibility from generation to generation. Emma looked up from a display case containing medieval coins that glittered like captured starlight. But why here? Why hide all this in Millbrook? Thomas found the answer several pages deeper in the journal. Father Marcus had chosen Sacred Heart Cathedral not despite its obscurity, but because of it. Millbrook was too small to attract attention from treasure hunters or government officials. Too poor to be considered a likely hiding place for immense wealth. Too forgotten to appear on anyone's map of significant cultural sites. Perfect camouflage, Grace observed, when Thomas read the passage aloud. Who would ever think to look for priceless Vatican treasures in a dying steel town? As the hours passed, Thomas began to understand the magnitude of what had fallen into his hands. This wasn't just an inheritance or a lucky discovery. It was a sacred trust that had been passed down through generations of faithful guardians. Father Marcus had spent his entire adult life protecting these treasures, maintaining their security, documenting their provenance, and preparing for the day when he would need to pass the responsibility to someone else. That someone, apparently, was Thomas. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said, as they finally prepared to leave the vault. "Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." "But Dad," Emma protested, "shouldn't we call the police, or the church, or someone in authority?" Thomas thought about that question as he secured the vault door and reset the hidden mechanism in the altar. Who exactly would he call? The local police, who barely had the resources to handle domestic disputes and traffic violations. The Catholic Church, which might claim ownership of everything and remove it from Millbrook forever. The federal government, which could tie everything up in legal proceedings for decades. Your mom used to say that when you find something valuable, the first thing you should do is figure out why it was lost in the first place, Thomas said, as they climbed the stone steps back toward the cathedral sanctuary. Father Marcus didn't hide these things from honest people trying to preserve history. He hid them from people who would exploit or destroy them. Until we know who those people might be, we keep this secret. That night, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his modest bedroom, his mind racing with possibilities and responsibilities. In a single day, he had gone from being a struggling widowed father to the guardian of one of the world's most significant private collections of religious art. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, but there was something else, too. For the first time since Sarah's death, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond simple survival. Father Marcus had trusted him with something precious, something that connected him to centuries of faith and sacrifice and preservation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Thomas knew he couldn't let that trust be broken. Over the next week, Thomas threw himself into research with an intensity that surprised his daughters. He spent hours at the Millbrook Public Library, combing through old newspapers and church records. He called the diocesan office and spoke to elderly priests who might have known Father Marcus. He even drove to the state archives in the capital, claiming to be researching the cathedral's history for a restoration project. What he learned painted a picture of an extraordinary man living an extraordinarily secret life. Father Marcus Aurelius, had indeed arrived at Sacred Heart Cathedral. In 1938, EC transferred from a parish in Austria that had been dissolved due to political pressures, a euphemism that clearly meant Nazi persecution. Church records showed that he had been assigned to Millbrook at his own request, asking specifically for a remote posting where he could pursue scholarly work without distractions. For more than 60 years, Father Marcus had served the small Catholic community of Millbrook with distinction but without fanfare. He had said daily Mass for dwindling congregations, performed marriages and baptisms and funerals, visited the sick, and comforted the grieving. By all accounts, he had been a good priest, kind, learned, devoted to his flock. But he had also maintained a careful distance from diocesan politics and church hierarchy. He had declined promotions and transfers, insisting that his calling was to serve the people of Millbrook. He had lived modestly in the cathedral rectory, growing his own vegetables, repairing his own car, asking for nothing beyond the basic necessities of life. What no one had suspected was that Father Marcus was also maintaining one of the world's most significant collections of religious artifacts, hidden beneath the altar of his humble parish church. The more Thomas learned, the more he understood why Father Marcus had been so secretive. Several of the pieces in the collection were listed in official databases as missing or destroyed. The crown of Wenceslaus was supposedly lost during the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. The Byzantine icon had last been seen during the fall of Constantinople. The Lindisfarne Psalter was believed to have been destroyed by Viking raiders 1,000 years ago. If any of these pieces surfaced publicly, it would create a firestorm of competing claims. Governments would demand the return of artifacts taken from their territories during wartime. Museums would file lawsuits claiming ownership based on previous acquisitions. The Catholic Church would certainly want to examine and possibly reclaim items that had belonged to various religious institutions over the centuries. And underneath all the legitimate claims would be the treasure hunters, the black market dealers, the criminals who saw only dollar signs where Father Marcus had seen sacred trust. No wonder he kept it secret, Thomas said to Emma and Grace as they sat around the kitchen table one evening, surrounded by printouts and photocopies of his research. Going public with this collection wouldn't just create legal problems. It could put the artifacts themselves at risk. Emma picked up a photocopy of a newspaper article from 1942. Local priest organizes relief efforts for European refugees. The accompanying photo showed a younger Father Marcus standing beside a truck loaded with supplies. He was helping people the whole time, she said. Even while he was hiding this incredible collection, he was also running relief organizations, helping refugees, doing normal priest things. How did he manage it all? Grace was studying a timeline Thomas had constructed, tracking the arrival of various artifacts based on Father Marcus's journal entries. Look at this pattern, she said. Most of the really valuable pieces arrived between 1938 and 1945. That's the war years. But then there are smaller additions all the way up through the 1980s. Other guardians must have been dying off, leaving their pieces to Father Marcus. Thomas nodded. He mentions that in several journal entries, the network of guardians was aging, and many of the younger priests didn't understand the mission. Father Marcus became a kind of last resort, the one guardian who could be trusted to protect things until a new generation of protectors could be found. But that generation never came, Emma said softly. No, Thomas agreed. Which is why we found the collection. Father Marcus ran out of time and trusted in Providence to bring the right person to the right place at the right moment. Over the following days, Thomas began reaching out to carefully selected experts, scholars and historians who specialized in medieval art and religious artifacts. He presented himself as a curious amateur, someone who had inherited some old church items and wanted to learn about their history. He shared photographs of a few pieces from the collection, claiming they were items he had found in church storage areas. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of medieval studies at the State University, became his primary contact. She was intrigued by the images Thomas showed her and began visiting the cathedral regularly to help with what she believed was historical research. "The architecture of this building is remarkable," she told Thomas during one of her visits to the restored sanctuary. "The stonework shows influences from both English and French Gothic traditions, which suggests the architect was exceptionally well educated. And these items you found, some of them appear to be extraordinarily significant." Thomas was walking a careful line, sharing enough information to get expert opinions and historical context, but never enough to reveal the full scope of what lay hidden beneath the altar. Dr. Rodriguez assumed he was researching the cathedral's past. She had no idea he was planning for its future. "This illuminated manuscript," she said, examining one of Thomas's photographs. "If it's authentic, it could be worth millions of dollars. The technique, the materials, the style, everything suggests it's a genuine medieval work, but I would need to examine it in person to be certain." "What would happen if something like that turned up publicly?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. Dr. Rodriguez frowned. "It would be complicated. There would be authentication processes, provenance research, legal reviews. If it had been stolen or taken illegally from another country, there could be repatriation claims. The art world is very sensitive about cultural patrimony these days, and if someone found a whole collection of such pieces, that would be extraordinary," she said slowly, "and potentially very dangerous for whoever found them. There are people in the art world who would do almost anything to get their hands on authentic medieval religious artifacts. The black market for such items is worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had been thinking about legal and bureaucratic challenges, but he hadn't fully considered the criminal element. If word got out about the collection, it wouldn't just attract lawyers and government officials. It would also attract people who might be willing to kill for access to such treasures. That evening, Thomas returned to the vault alone, leaving Emma and Grace at home, with instructions to call the police if he didn't return by midnight. He needed time to think, to process what he had learned, to understand fully what Father Marcus had entrusted to his care. The underground chamber felt different when he was alone. Quieter somehow, but also more alive, as if the artifacts themselves were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Thomas walked slowly through the collection, reading placards, studying the careful arrangements Father Marcus had created. At the reading desk, he opened the journal to a passage he had read several times but never fully absorbed. "The greatest challenge of being a guardian is not protecting these treasures from thieves, or governments, or natural disasters. The greatest challenge is protecting them from well-meaning people who do not understand that some things are too precious to be owned by anyone. These artifacts do not belong to me, or to the church, or to any nation. They belong to humanity's highest aspirations, to the eternal hope that beauty and faith can survive any darkness. My role is not to possess them, but to preserve them until they can fulfill their true purpose, to inspire, to teach, to remind people that there is something in this world worth believing in, worth fighting for, worth dying for." Thomas closed the journal and looked around the vault one more time. 57 major pieces, according to his count, plus dozens of smaller artifacts. Conservative estimates based on Dr. Rodriguez's reactions suggested the collection could be worth between $200 and $300 million. But as Father Marcus had written, the real value wasn't monetary. These were items that connected the present to the past, that embodied centuries of faith and artistry and human devotion. And now they were his responsibility. Thomas climbed the stone steps back to the cathedral sanctuary, sealed the hidden panel, and locked the front doors behind him. As he walked to his truck under a sky brilliant with stars, he realized that his life had changed forever. He was no longer just Thomas Mitchell, widowed father and part-time construction worker. He was the guardian of one of the world's greatest treasures, the keeper of secrets that powerful people had died to protect. The question now was what to do with that incredible responsibility. Father Marcus had preserved the collection for more than 60 years, waiting for someone worthy to take his place. Thomas knew he couldn't simply continue hiding the treasures indefinitely. But he also couldn't risk exposing them to exploitation or destruction. Somewhere between those extremes lay a path that would honor Father Marcus's trust while serving the higher purpose for which these artifacts had been preserved. Thomas just had to find it. Thomas spent the following weeks diving deeper into Father Marcus's past, with the methodical determination of a man who understood that knowledge was the only weapon he had against forces he couldn't yet identify. Every morning before dawn, he would drive to the cathedral and descend into the vault, reading through decades of journal entries by the light of the LED fixtures Father Marcus had installed. Every afternoon, he researched at the library, the diocesan archives, and online databases, piecing together a story that grew more extraordinary with each discovered detail. The picture that emerged was of a man who had lived two completely different lives in the same small body. To the people of Millbrook, Father Marcus Aurelius had been a quiet, scholarly priest who said Mass every morning at 7, visited the sick every Tuesday, and grew the finest tomatoes in 3 counties. But hidden beneath that humble exterior was one of the most important cultural preservationists of the 20th century, a guardian whose secret work had saved treasures that would otherwise have been lost to war, persecution, and the simple passage of time. The story began in 1937, when Father Marcus was still Father Heinrich Zimmermann, a young priest and art historian working at the Melk Abbey in Austria. According to documents Thomas found in the diocesan archives, Father Heinrich had been part of a small group of clerics and scholars who saw the storm clouds gathering across Europe and understood what was coming. They had watched the Nazis burn books in Berlin, destroy synagogues in Vienna, and loot museums across the territories they occupied. They knew that when the war came, it would bring with it an unprecedented assault on humanity's cultural heritage. The Guardians, as they called themselves, began their work in secret, identifying the most precious and vulnerable artifacts in churches, monasteries, and private collections across Catholic Europe. Their mission was simple in concept, but terrifyingly dangerous in execution. Remove irreplaceable treasures from harm's way and hide them until the madness passed. Some artifacts were evacuated to the Vatican, where the Pope's neutrality offered at least nominal protection. Others were hidden in remote mountain monasteries or buried in sealed chambers beneath ancient churches. But the most valuable pieces, items whose loss would represent irreparable damage to human civilization, were scattered among trusted guardians in unlikely locations around the world. Thomas found the first detailed reference to this network in a journal entry dated March 19, 1939, just days after the German invasion of Czechoslovakia. Brother Wolfgang arrived yesterday with devastating news. The crown of Wenceslaus has been seized by SS officers who broke into the cathedral at Prague. But Wolfgang managed to substitute a replica he had commissioned months ago, anticipating this day. The real crown is hidden in his personal effects. He departs tomorrow for the Atlantic crossing. If God wills it, the crown will find sanctuary in the New World, far from the reach of those who would melt it down for gold, or display it as a trophy of conquest. Page after page revealed similar stories. The Lindisfarne Psalter, rescued from a burning monastery by a monk who died of smoke inhalation after ensuring its safety. The Byzantine icon, smuggled out of a bombed church in Yugoslavia by a nun who walked 300 miles through enemy territory to reach Allied lines. The Chalice of Urban, carried by a priest who spent 2 years in a German labor camp, but never revealed its location to his captors. Each artifact had arrived at Sacred Heart Cathedral with documentation written in Father Marcus's careful hand, recording not just the object's historical significance, but the human cost of its preservation. Every piece represented someone's sacrifice, someone's decision to risk everything for the sake of beauty and faith, and the hope that future generations would understand what had been saved for them. These men and women weren't just preserving objects, Thomas realized as he read entry after entry. They were preserving the best of human civilization itself. The scope of the network became clearer as Thomas traced references scattered throughout the journal. Guardians had operated from Ireland to Greece, from Norway to Sicily. Some were priests and nuns. Others were professors, museum curators, wealthy collectors who opened their homes to refugees and their art. A few were ordinary citizens who simply understood that some things were too precious to let evil destroy. Most had paid a terrible price for their courage. Father Marcus's journal recorded the fates of dozens of his fellow guardians. Brother Wolfgang, who had saved the crown of Wenceslaus, was arrested by the Gestapo in 1942 and died in Dachau. Sister Catherine, who had preserved a collection of illuminated manuscripts from a French abbey, was executed by firing squad for crimes against the Reich. Professor Kowalski, who had hidden medieval artifacts in the basement of the University of Warsaw, disappeared during the Warsaw Uprising and was never seen again. But their sacrifices had not been in vain. By the war's end, the Guardian network had saved hundreds of priceless artifacts from destruction. Some had been returned to their original locations after the fighting stopped. Others had found permanent homes in major museums, but a significant number, the most precious, the most vulnerable, the most likely to attract unwanted attention, had remained hidden with their wartime guardians. As the years passed and the original guardians aged and died, responsibility for their protected treasures had gradually concentrated among a smaller and smaller group of survivors. By 1980, according to Father Marcus's records, only 7 active guardians remained worldwide. By 1995, only 3. And since 2010, only Father Marcus himself had carried the burden of the secret trust. He was the last one, Thomas said to Emma and Grace as they sat around the kitchen table one evening, surrounded by photocopies and printouts of his research. For the past 15 years, Father Marcus was the only person left who knew where these treasures were hidden. Grace looked up from a timeline she had been drawing, tracking the movement of artifacts through the Guardian network. That's why he was so worried about finding a successor. It wasn't just about preserving the collection here in Millbrook. He was preserving the entire memory of what the Guardians had accomplished. Emma had been studying photographs of some of the artifacts, comparing them to images she had found in art history textbooks. "Dad, I think we're looking at more than just individual treasures. Some of these pieces, they're the only surviving examples of their type. Like this illuminated gospel according to this book, all the other copies from the same scriptorium were destroyed during the Reformation. This might be the only window we have into an entire tradition of medieval art." Thomas nodded grimly. "Which means, if anything happens to this collection, if it's broken up or lost or stolen, we're not just losing money, we're losing irreplaceable pieces of human history." The weight of that responsibility had been keeping Thomas awake at night. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Father Marcus, alone in the cathedral rectory, tending to his secret charges year after year, knowing that he was the only thing standing between priceless treasures and the forces that would destroy them. The old priest had carried that burden for more than 60 years. Now it belonged to Thomas. But Thomas was beginning to understand that he didn't have to carry it alone. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been visiting the cathedral weekly, ostensibly to help with historical research, but increasingly out of genuine fascination with the building's architecture and Thomas's growing collection of historical documents. Thomas had been careful to share information gradually, allowing her to develop theories and draw conclusions rather than simply presenting her with facts. But he could see that she was beginning to suspect there was more to his research than simple academic curiosity. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Dr. Rodriguez arrived at the cathedral carrying a thick folder of research materials. "Thomas," she said without preamble, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to tell me the truth. These photographs you've been showing me, these documents you claim to have found in church records, where did they really come from?" Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Dr. Rodriguez set her folder on one of the restored pews and fixed him with the kind of stare that had probably terrified graduate students for decades. "I mean that I've spent the past month trying to verify the provenance of the items in your photographs, and I've discovered something very interesting. Several of these pieces match descriptions of artifacts that were reported missing or destroyed during World War II. The illuminated gospel manuscript you showed me last week? It's identical to one that was lost when the Germans bombed Monte Cassino Abbey. The Byzantine icon? It matches perfectly with one that disappeared from a museum in Belgrade in 1941. Thomas remained silent, unsure how much he could safely reveal. "Now," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "either you've stumbled across an extraordinary collection of extremely convincing forgeries, or you've found something that a lot of very important people have been looking for a very long time. Which is it?" "Coming." Thomas looked at this woman who had become not just a research partner but something approaching a friend. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had dedicated her life to studying medieval art and had published papers on cultural preservation during wartime. If anyone could understand the significance of Father Marcus's collection, it would be her. "Elena," he said carefully, "if I showed you something extraordinary, something that would have to remain absolutely confidential until we could figure out how to handle it properly, would I be able to trust you?" Her expression softened. "Thomas, I've spent my entire career studying objects that survived against impossible odds. I understand the difference between academic curiosity and sacred responsibility. If you found something significant, yes, you can trust me." Thomas made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. "Come with me," he said. 20 minutes later, Dr. Rodriguez stood in the doorway of Father Marcus's vault. tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the magnitude of what she was seeing. "My God," she whispered. "This is the Guardian collection." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You know about the Guardians?" Dr. Rodriguez wiped her eyes and stepped deeper into the chamber. "I've been researching them for 15 years. They're legends in my field. This secret network of priests and scholars who saved artifacts during the war. Most historians believe they were just rumors, or at least that any treasures they might have preserved were lost decades ago. But this," she gestured around the vault, "this proves they were real. All of it." She moved through the collection like someone walking through a cathedral, pausing at each display case, reading each placard with reverence. When she reached the reading desk with Father Marcus's journal, she stopped completely. "May I?" she asked. Thomas nodded. Dr. Rodriguez read the final entry in silence, then turned back several pages, absorbing decades of careful documentation. "Father Marcus Aurelius," she said finally. "I should have realized. I've seen his name mentioned in a few obscure documents, always in connection with refugee relief work during the war. But I never suspected that he was one of the last guardians," Thomas finished. "The last guardian," Dr. Rodriguez corrected. "According to this journal, he was the sole survivor of the network. Which means..." She looked around the vault again. "This isn't just a collection. This is the entire legacy of one of the most important preservation efforts in human history." Over the following weeks, Dr. Rodriguez became Thomas's guide to the complex world of art authentication, cultural patrimony, law, and international antiquities regulations. She helped him understand not just what he had inherited, but what it would mean to make that inheritance public. "The good news," she explained, during one of their planning sessions, "is that Father Marcus documented everything meticulously. Every piece has clear provenance, photographs showing its condition at various points, even correspondence with other guardians about its history and significance. From a legal standpoint, this collection is as clean as anything I've ever seen." "And the bad news?" Thomas asked. "The bad news is that clean legal title doesn't prevent political complications. Some of these pieces will trigger repatriation claims from countries that consider them part of their national heritage. Others will attract attention from museums that have been searching for them for decades. And a few..." She paused. "A few are so valuable and so famous that making their existence known will create security challenges you can't imagine." Thomas thought about that for several days before making his next decision. If he was going to protect Father Marcus's legacy properly, he would need more than one expert advisor. He would need a team. Dr. Rodriguez helped him identify potential partners. Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in authentication and provenance research, who had worked with several major museums on Nazi-era art recovery. Maria Santos, a lawyer who specialized in cultural property law and had handled several high-profile repatriation cases. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, an expert in conservation and museum security, who understood the practical challenges of protecting priceless artifacts. Each person was carefully vetted before being approached. Thomas and Dr. Rodriguez researched their backgrounds, read their publications, spoke to their colleagues. They were looking not just for expertise, but for people who understood that some things were more important than personal advancement or institutional politics. The recruitment process took months. Thomas would approach each potential team member with a simple question. If you discovered that someone had spent decades preserving priceless artifacts at great personal risk, and that responsibility was now being passed to you, what would you do? Dr. Morrison's answer came immediately. I'd make sure their sacrifice wasn't wasted. Maria Santos was more cautious. I'd want to understand the legal implications first. But if everything was handled properly, I'd try to find a way to honor both the letter and the spirit of what they had done. Summoned. Doctor. Hassan thought for a long moment before responding. I'd remember that preservation isn't just about protecting objects. It's about protecting the stories they tell and the faith they represent. One by one, Thomas revealed the existence of Father Marcus's collection to his chosen advisors. Each reacted with the same mixture of awe, excitement, and overwhelming responsibility that Thomas had felt during his first descent into the vault. This changes everything we thought we knew about wartime preservation efforts, Dr. Morrison said after spending an entire day examining and photographing artifacts. Some of these pieces were written off as losses 70 years ago. Finding them intact, perfectly preserved, with complete documentation, it's like discovering a time capsule from civilization's darkest hour. Maria Santos was more focused on practical implications. The legal challenges will be significant but manageable, assuming we handle everything transparently. The key is going to be establishing a clear framework for ownership and access that serves the public good while protecting the collection's integrity. Dr. Hassan's concerns were more immediate. The security upgrades alone will cost several $1 million. This building is naturally defensible, but it's not equipped to protect artifacts worth hundreds of millions. We'll need climate control systems, fire suppression, intrusion detection, and physical barriers that won't destroy the cathedral's historical character. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas found himself leading regular strategy sessions with his expanding team of experts. They met in the cathedral sanctuary, surrounded by the beauty that Father Marcus had spent decades protecting, planning for a future that would honor his sacrifice while serving the higher purpose for which the Guardians had risked everything. The question we keep coming back to, Dr. Rodriguez said during one of these sessions, is ownership versus stewardship. Father Marcus never owned these artifacts in any traditional sense. He was their guardian, their protector. Now we have the same responsibility. Thomas looked around the restored sanctuary, thinking about the incredible treasures hidden beneath its altar. So, we don't try to own them. We create something that protects them while sharing them. Something that honors Father Marcus's trust while serving the mission the Guardians started almost a century ago. The solution they developed was unprecedented. A non-profit foundation dedicated to preserving and sharing artifacts that had been saved by the Guardian network. The Sacred Heart Foundation would legally own the collection, ensuring that it could never be sold or dispersed for private gain. Access would be free and open to the public, but carefully controlled to ensure both security and respect. It's not quite a museum, Maria Santos explained to Thomas one afternoon, as they reviewed legal documents. And it's not quite a church. It's something new, a place where people can encounter objects that embody humanity's highest aspirations, preserved by people who understood that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect. Thomas signed the incorporation papers on a snowy January morning, surrounded by Emma, Grace, and the team of experts who had become not just advisors but friends. As he set down the pen, he thought about Father Marcus spending his final day tending to the collection that had consumed his life, trusting that Providence would bring the right person to continue his work. "I hope we're worthy of that trust," he said quietly. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "I think Father Marcus knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that final journal entry. He wasn't just documenting the end of his guardianship. He was announcing the beginning of ours." The announcement of the Sacred Heart Foundation was still months away, but the real work had already begun. hidden beneath the altar of a restored Gothic cathedral in a forgotten American town. One of the world's most significant collections of religious art waited patiently for its next chapter. The Guardian's mission would continue, carried forward by people who understood that the greatest treasures are not those that are possessed, but those that are shared with reverence, protected with wisdom, and preserved for generations yet to come. Thomas Mitchell was no longer just a widowed father trying to survive his grief. He had become something he never could have imagined, the leader of a movement that would transform not just his own life, but the lives of countless people who needed to believe that beauty and faith could survive any darkness the world might bring. Thomas spent sleepless nights poring over Father Marcus's journal, each page revealing layers of a story so extraordinary it seemed impossible that one man could have lived such a profound double life. By day, the elderly priest had tended to his small parish, saying morning mass for a dwindling congregation, visiting the sick, maintaining the crumbling cathedral with his own aging hands. But by night, he had been something else, entirely the last guardian of a secret network that had saved humanity's greatest treasures from the darkness of war. The journal entries painted a picture of methodical genius. Father Marcus hadn't simply collected valuable artifacts. He had orchestrated one of history's most successful preservation efforts, coordinating with contacts across 3 continents to ensure that irreplaceable pieces of human heritage survived when entire civilizations were under attack. Thomas discovered the true beginning of the story in an entry dated September 15, 1937. Written in the precise handwriting of a much younger man. The signs are unmistakable now. Brother Wolfgang writes from Vienna that SA troops have begun inspecting Jewish collections under the pretense of rooting out degenerate art. Professor Kellner reports similar activities in Munich, where stormtroopers destroyed the Rothschild illuminated manuscripts last Tuesday. We can no longer pretend this madness will pass. The time has come to act. Today I received papal approval for Project Sanctuary. May God forgive us for what we are about to do, and may He grant us wisdom to preserve what evil seeks to destroy. Project Sanctuary. Thomas had never heard the name before, but as he read deeper into the journal, its scope became breathtaking. Operating under direct Vatican authority but with complete operational secrecy, a network of priests, scholars, and art historians had identified the most precious and vulnerable artifacts in Catholic Europe and begun moving them to safety. The operation was far more sophisticated than Thomas had initially understood. Rather than random rescue efforts, the Guardians had developed a systematic approach to cultural preservation that anticipated the patterns of Nazi looting and destruction. They studied German military strategy, tracked the movements of SS art acquisition teams, and stayed one step ahead of forces that saw beauty as either propaganda or plunder. "We are not thieves," Father Marcus had written in October 1938. "We are custodians of eternal beauty, protecting sacred objects until the world remembers what it means to be human. Each piece we save is a victory against those who would reduce faith to ashes and art to gold." The network's methods were as ingenious as they were dangerous. Artifacts were often replaced with expertly crafted forgeries, allowing the originals to disappear, while their absence went unnoticed for months or years. Documents were forged to create false provenance chains that led investigators away from the truth. Shipping routes were disguised as medical supplies or agricultural equipment, moving priceless medieval manuscripts in crates labeled as bandages or fertilizer. But it was the human cost that kept Thomas reading long past midnight, his coffee growing cold as he absorbed story after story of ordinary people who had risked everything for objects they would never own. Sister Catherine Moreau had died in a Gestapo interrogation cell, tortured for 3 days, before she finally broke and revealed the location of 17 illuminated manuscripts hidden in the false floor of her convent's chapel. But by then, the manuscripts were already gone, moved to safety by a network she had helped establish, but whose full scope she had never known. Brother Wolfgang Steinberg had spent 2 years in Dachau after being caught with forged transportation documents, but he never revealed that the medical supplies he had been carrying actually contained the crown of Wenceslaus and 3 Byzantine reliquaries worth more than the annual budget of most European nations. Professor Elena Kowalski had been executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the University of Warsaw, but not before she had successfully evacuated 43 pieces from the university's medieval collection, including a 13th-century psalter that was now one of the crown jewels of Father Marcus's hidden vault. Each story was documented with meticulous care: names, dates, final letters, witness accounts. Father Marcus had created not just an inventory of saved artifacts, but a memorial to the people who had died saving them. They understood something that the world has forgotten, Thomas said to Emma and Grace, as they sat in the cathedral sanctuary one evening, the journal open between them. They knew that some things are worth dying for, not because they're expensive, but because they represent the best of what humans can create when they're inspired by something greater than themselves. Grace traced her finger along a journal entry that described the rescue of a carved ivory crucifix from a burning monastery in France. It's like they were firefighters, but instead of saving people from buildings, they were saving beauty from a world that had gone insane. Emma was studying a photograph Father Marcus had taken of himself with 3 other priests in 1941, standing in front of Sacred Heart Cathedral just after the arrival of what the journal called the Prague shipment. They looked ordinary middle-aged men in simple black cassocks, smiling modestly at the camera. Nothing in their appearance suggested they were participants in one of the most audacious preservation efforts in human history. How many people were involved? Emma asked. How big was this network? Thomas had been wondering the same thing. Father Marcus's journal referenced dozens of individuals by name and hinted at many more who remained anonymous for security reasons. But the full scope only became clear when Thomas found a document tucked into the back of the journal, a hand-drawn map of Europe with lines connecting various cities and symbols marking different types of operations. The network had extended from Ireland to Greece, from Norway to Sicily. Major nodes were marked in Vienna, Prague, Munich, Paris, Rome, and Budapest cities, where Guardian teams had been particularly active. Smaller symbols indicated safe houses, temporary storage locations, and extraction points. Lines showed evacuation routes that had moved artifacts through neutral countries like Switzerland and Portugal, before shipping them to permanent hiding places in the Americas, Australia, and remote monasteries in Asia. There must have been hundreds of people involved, Thomas realized as he studied the map. Priests, nuns, professors, museum curators, wealthy collectors, even ordinary citizens who opened their homes to refugees and their art. But the network's greatest strength had also proved to be its weakness. As the war ended and the immediate threat passed, many Guardians had returned to their normal lives, assuming their mission was complete. Some had repatriated artifacts to rebuild churches and museums. Others had donated their protected treasures to major institutions. A few had sold pieces to fund reconstruction efforts in devastated communities. Only a small core of the most dedicated Guardians had understood that the mission wasn't finished. The artifacts they had saved weren't just valuable objects. They were irreplaceable links to humanity's spiritual and cultural heritage. In the wrong hands, they could be exploited, commercialized, or simply lost to bureaucratic indifference. That's why Father Marcus kept everything here, Thomas said. Reading from a journal entry dated 1953, he realized that the world wasn't ready to handle these treasures properly. Too many people saw dollar signs instead of sacred trust. The entries from the 1950s and 60s told a different story than the wartime years. Instead of dramatic rescues and narrow escapes, Father Marcus wrote about the slow, patient work of long-term preservation. He had modernized the vault's climate control systems, installed security measures, and created detailed documentation for every piece in his care. He had also begun accepting artifacts from other aging guardians who had no suitable successors. By 1970, the journal revealed Father Marcus had become the unofficial coordinator of guardian activities worldwide. When Father Giuseppe Benedetti died in Rome, his collection of early Christian artifacts was quietly shipped to Millbrook. When Professor Hans Müller passed away in Munich, his carefully preserved medieval manuscripts found their way to Sacred Heart Cathedral. When Sister Mary Catherine closed her hidden gallery in Dublin, her Byzantine icons crossed the Atlantic to join Father Marcus's growing collection. He was like a sanctuary of last resort, Grace observed. When the other guardians couldn't find anyone to trust with their treasures, they sent them to him. Thomas nodded. Reading from a particularly poignant entry dated December 1978. Father Benedetti's final letter arrived today, along with the 3 cases he promised to send. Lung cancer, he writes, and no one in his order understands the importance of what he has protected for 35 years. Better that our treasures should live in your American exile than die in Roman ignorance, he says. I have prepared places for his artifacts in the Eastern Gallery, near the illuminated Gospels. Each piece that arrives here represents not just immense historical value, but the life's work of someone who understood that beauty is humanity's highest achievement. I am no longer just a guardian. I am a curator of other people's faith made manifest. The weight of that responsibility had clearly affected Father Marcus deeply. His later journal entries showed a man increasingly isolated by the magnitude of what he was protecting, unable to share his burden with anyone who could truly understand its scope. What happens next will reveal the true scale of the network Thomas has stumbled into, expose the dangerous forces still hunting for these treasures, and force him to make a decision that could save or destroy one of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. Stay tuned to discover how a simple widowed father becomes the guardian of secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. If you're captivated by this incredible story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Thomas knew he needed help, but finding the right people would require extreme care. The wrong choice could expose the collection to exactly the kind of exploitation Father Marcus had spent his life preventing. After weeks of internal debate, Thomas decided to start with someone whose reputation for integrity was beyond question. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was a professor of medieval studies at the State University, known for her work on cultural preservation during wartime. More importantly, her published papers showed a deep understanding of the ethical complexities surrounding artifacts that had changed hands during periods of conflict. Thomas approached her carefully, beginning with casual conversations about the cathedral's architecture and gradually sharing selected photographs of what he described as items found in old church storage areas. Dr. Rodriguez's reactions told him everything he needed to know about her character. These pieces, she said during one of their meetings, examining a photograph of an illuminated manuscript. If they're authentic, they represent more than monetary value. They're windows into ways of thinking and creating that we've lost. Whoever preserved these understood something important about the difference between owning art and stewarding it. Encouraged by her response, Thomas began sharing more information. He showed her copies of Father Marcus's documentation, described the preservation efforts that had saved the artifacts, and gradually built toward the moment when he would have to reveal the full scope of what he had discovered. That moment came on a gray February afternoon when Dr. Rodriguez arrived at the cathedral, carrying a folder of research materials and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Thomas," she said without preamble, "I need you to be completely honest with me. The photographs you've been showing me, where did they really come from? Because I've spent the past month researching these pieces, and I've discovered something extraordinary." She opened her folder and spread out a series of documents. This illuminated gospel manuscript, it matches perfectly with one that was reported destroyed when Monte Cassino Abbey was bombed in 1944. This Byzantine icon, it's identical to one that disappeared from a museum in Belgrade in 1941. This medieval chalice, it's listed in Vatican records as missing since the German occupation of Rome. Thomas felt his pulse quicken but remained silent. "Now, Dr. Rodriguez continued, either you've stumbled across the most elaborate collection of forgeries in history, or you've found artifacts that a lot of very important people have been searching for decades. Which is it?" Thomas studied her face, looking for any sign of the greed or ambition that could make her dangerous to trust. All he saw was scholarly excitement tempered by ethical awareness, exactly what he had hoped to find. "Elena," he said carefully, "if I showed you something that would have to remain absolutely confidential until we could figure out how to handle it properly, could I trust you to put the preservation of these artifacts above any personal or professional considerations?" Her expression grew serious. "Thomas, I've dedicated my career to studying objects that survived against impossible odds. I understand the difference between academic curiosity and moral responsibility. Yes, you can trust me." Thomas made the decision that would change everything that followed. "Come with me." 30 minutes later, Dr. Rodriguez stood in the doorway of Father Marcus's vault, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the magnitude of what she was seeing. "Dear God," she whispered, "this is a guardian sanctuary." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You know about the guardians?" Dr. Rodriguez wiped her eyes and stepped deeper into the chamber. "I've been researching them for 20 years. They're legends in my field, this secret network of priests and scholars who saved artifacts during the war. Most historians believe they were mostly myths, or that any treasures they preserved were lost or dispersed decades ago. But this," she gestured around the vault, "this proves everything. The scope, the organization, the commitment, it's all here." She moved through the collection like someone walking through a sacred space, pausing at each display case, reading each placard with reverence. When she reached Father Marcus's reading desk, she asked permission before touching the journal. "Father Marcus Aurelius," she said after reading several entries. "I should have connected the name. He's mentioned in a few obscure documents I've found, always in connection with refugee relief work. But I never suspected he was one of the guardians themselves." "The last guardian," Thomas corrected. "According to his journal, he was the sole survivor of the network for the final 15 years of his life." Dr. Rodriguez closed the journal carefully and looked around the vault again. "Which means this isn't just a collection. This is the entire legacy of one of the most important preservation efforts in human history. Over the following weeks, Dr. Rodriguez became Thomas's guide through the complex world of art authentication, cultural property law, and international antiquities regulations. She helped him understand not just what he had inherited, but what it would mean to make that inheritance public. The legal situation is actually quite favorable, she explained during one of their planning sessions. Father Marcus documented everything meticulously. Every piece has clear provenance, showing how it was legally acquired by the church and then entrusted to guardian protection. From a legal standpoint, this collection is cleaner than most museum acquisitions. Then what's the problem? Thomas asked. Dr. Rodriguez frowned. The problem is that clean legal title doesn't prevent political complications. Some of these pieces will trigger repatriation claims from countries that consider them part of their cultural patrimony. Others will attract attention from museums and collectors who have been searching for them for decades. And some are so valuable that simply making their existence known will create security risks you can't imagine. Thomas began to understand why Father Marcus had kept the collection hidden for so long. It wasn't just about protecting the artifacts from theft, it was about protecting them from a world that might not be ready to handle them responsibly. But Thomas also realized that indefinite secrecy wasn't sustainable. He was approaching 50, and unlike Father Marcus, he had no religious order to provide structure and purpose for his guardianship. Emma and Grace were brilliant young women, but they deserved to make their own choices about their futures, not inherit a burden they hadn't chosen. I think Father Marcus knew this day would come, Thomas said, as he and Dr. Rodriguez sat in the cathedral sanctuary one evening. He spent 60 years protecting these treasures until someone could be found who understood their true purpose. Maybe that time has finally arrived. Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. But if we're going to do this right, we'll need more than just the two of us. The challenges are too complex for any individual to handle alone. Over the next several months, they assembled a small team of carefully vetted experts. Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in art authentication, who had worked with several major museums on Nazi-era art recovery. Maria Santos, a lawyer who specialized in cultural property law and had handled high-profile repatriation cases. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, an expert in museum security, who understood the practical challenges of protecting priceless artifacts. Each potential team member was approached with the same careful process. Thomas and Dr. Rodriguez researched their backgrounds thoroughly, reading their publications, speaking to their colleagues, looking for any evidence of the integrity and discretion the project would require. The recruitment conversations were delicate dances of revelation and assessment. Thomas would describe a hypothetical situation. If you discovered that someone had spent decades preserving priceless artifacts at great personal risk, and that responsibility was now being passed to you, how would you handle it? Dr. Morrison's response was immediate and passionate. I'd make damn sure their sacrifice wasn't wasted. Too many important artifacts have been lost to politics and bureaucracy. If someone had the courage to save them, I'd have the courage to make sure they served their proper purpose. Maria Santos was more cautious, but equally committed. I'd want to understand all the legal implications first. But if everything was handled properly, I'd try to find a way that honored both the letter and the spirit of what they had done. Dr. Hassan took longer to consider his answer. I'd remember that preservation isn't just about protecting objects from thieves. It's about protecting the stories they tell and the faith they represent. Security isn't just locks and alarms, it's making sure these things reach the people who need to see them. One by one, as each expert proved their worthiness, Thomas revealed the existence of Father Marcus's collection. Each reacted with the same mixture of awe, excitement, and overwhelming responsibility that Thomas had felt during his first descent into the vault. This changes everything we thought we knew about wartime preservation efforts, Dr. Morrison said after spending a full day examining and photographing artifacts. Some of these pieces were written off as permanent losses 70 years ago. Finding them intact, perfectly preserved, with complete documentation, it's like discovering a message from the past about what really matters. Maria Santos focused on practical implications. The legal challenges will be significant, but manageable, assuming we approach everything transparently. The key will be establishing a clear framework that serves the public good while protecting the collection's integrity. Dr. Hassan's concerns were more immediate. The security requirements alone will cost millions. This building has good bones, but it's not equipped to protect artifacts worth hundreds of millions. We'll need systems that provide museum-level protection without destroying the cathedral's character. As winter turned to spring, Thomas found himself leading regular strategy sessions with his expanding team. They met in the restored sanctuary, surrounded by Gothic arches and colored light, planning a future that would honor Father Marcus's sacrifice while serving the higher purpose for which the Guardians had risked everything. The solution they developed was unprecedented. The Sacred Heart Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing artifacts saved by the Guardian Network. The foundation would own the collection legally, ensuring it could never be sold or dispersed for private gain. Access would be free and open to the public, but carefully managed to ensure both security and reverence. It's not exactly a museum, Maria Santos explained to Thomas as they reviewed incorporation documents. And it's not exactly a church. It's something new, a place where people can encounter objects that represent humanity's highest aspirations, preserved by people who understood that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect. Thomas signed the foundation documents on a bright April morning, surrounded by Emma, Grace, and the team of experts who had become trusted colleagues. As he set down the pen, he thought about Father Marcus spending his final years alone with his incredible secret, trusting that Providence would eventually bring the right people to continue his mission. "I hope we're worthy of his trust," Thomas said quietly. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "I think Father Marcus knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just documenting the end of his guardianship, he was announcing the beginning of ours." The public revelation was still months away, but the real work had already begun. Hidden beneath the altar of a Gothic cathedral in forgotten Millbrook, one of the world's most significant collections of religious art waited patiently for its moment in history. The Guardian tradition would continue, carried forward by people who understood that the greatest treasures are not those that are possessed, but those that are shared with wisdom, protected with courage, and preserved for generations who would need proof that beauty can survive any darkness. Thomas Mitchell was no longer just a grieving widower trying to raise his daughters alone. He had become the leader of something unprecedented, a movement that would demonstrate to a cynical world that there were still people willing to dedicate their lives to preserving what was sacred, beautiful, and eternal. The Guardian's work was far from over. It was just beginning. The morning of the public announcement dawned crisp and clear, with October sunlight streaming through the restored stained glass windows of Sacred Heart Cathedral, like a blessing made visible. Thomas stood in the sanctuary, adjusting his tie for the third time, watching as reporters, scholars, and townspeople filed into the pews that had been empty for so many years. Emma and Grace flanked him, both wearing dresses that had belonged to their mother, looking more like young women than the broken teenagers who had first followed him into this building 18 months ago. "You ready for this, Dad?" Emma asked, squeezing his hand. Thomas looked out at the assembled crowd, maybe 100 people, including local residents who remembered the cathedral's glory days, university professors who had heard rumors of an important discovery, and carefully selected journalists who specialized in cultural and religious news. In the front row sat Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Morrison, Maria Santos, and Dr. Hassan, the team that had helped transform his impossible discovery into a sustainable mission. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for something like this," Thomas admitted. "But your mom always said that the most important things in life are the ones that scare you the most." Grace smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like Sarah. She also said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. Thomas nodded, stepped up to the podium they had positioned near the altar, and began to speak. "My name is Thomas Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the restored acoustics of the cathedral. 18 months ago, I bought this building for $1, thinking I was getting a fixer-upper project that would keep me and my daughters busy while we grieved the loss of my wife, their mother. I had no idea I was inheriting a sacred trust that would change our lives and, I hope, touch the lives of many others." He paused, looking directly at the reporters. "What I'm about to show you has been hidden beneath this altar for more than 70 years, protected by a remarkable priest named Father Marcus Aurelius, who dedicated his life to preserving treasures that belong not to any individual or institution, but to all humanity." Thomas activated the hidden mechanism in the altar, and the stone panel swung open to reveal the narrow passage that led to the vault below. Gasps filled the sanctuary as people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Before we go downstairs," Thomas continued, "I want you to understand what you're about to see, and more importantly, what it represents." Father Marcus was part of a network of people who risked everything during World War II to save religious and cultural artifacts from destruction. The collection he assembled here represents not just immense monetary value, but immense spiritual and historical significance. He gestured toward the hidden passage. "This collection is not for sale. It will never be for sale. These treasures have been protected for decades so that they could serve their highest purpose: to inspire, to educate, to connect people with the sacred and the eternal." One by one, the visitors descended into the vault, their voices falling to whispers as they encountered Father Marcus's carefully preserved collection. Thomas watched their faces, the wonder, the reverence, the sudden understanding that they were in the presence of something far greater than they had imagined. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store stood transfixed by an illuminated prayer book, her weathered hands clasped in front of her chest as she absorbed the gold lettering and intricate miniature paintings. Jake Morrison, the laid-off steelworker who had helped with the cathedral restoration, stared in amazement at a carved ivory crucifix that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Even the reporters, trained to maintain professional detachment, moved through the vault with the careful reverence of people who understood they were witnessing history. When everyone had seen the collection and returned to the sanctuary, Thomas made his final announcement. Starting next month, Sacred Heart Cathedral will reopen as the home of the Sacred Heart Foundation, a cultural and spiritual center dedicated to preserving and sharing the legacy of the Guardian Network. Portions of this collection will be displayed in rotating exhibits, free and open to the public. We'll also host lectures, concerts, and educational programs designed to help people understand both the historical significance of these artifacts and the faith they represent. A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Mitchell, have you received any estimate of the collection's monetary value?" Thomas smiled. "Our experts believe it's worth somewhere between $200 and $300 million. But that's not really the point, is it? You can't put a price on faith made manifest in gold and stone and illuminated parchment. You can't calculate the value of beauty that has survived persecution, war, and centuries of human folly." Another reporter. "Have you been contacted by museums or governments wanting to claim any of these pieces?" "Not yet," Thomas answered honestly. "But we expect we will be. Our legal team has researched the provenance of every item in the collection. We're prepared to work with any legitimate claimants. And we're committed to complete transparency. But we're also committed to keeping the collection together and accessible to the public, honoring the vision of the people who risked their lives to preserve these treasures." Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward to add her perspective. "This collection is remarkable, not just for its individual pieces, but for its coherence as a whole. Father Marcus and his fellow guardians assembled these items over decades, creating a comprehensive survey of Christian art and history that would be impossible to recreate today. Breaking up the collection would be a tragedy for scholarship and human understanding." The questions continued for another hour, with Thomas answering as honestly as he could, while being careful not to reveal details that might compromise security. When the formal presentation ended, people lingered in small groups throughout the cathedral, sharing their amazement and discussing what they had witnessed. Thomas found himself standing alone near the altar, watching his neighbors and the visiting experts mingle in animated conversation. Emma and Grace appeared beside him, both glowing with pride and excitement. "You did it, Dad," Emma said softly. "You figured out what Father Marcus wanted." Grace nodded. "Mom would be so proud. You took something broken and made it beautiful again." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. For 18 months, he had carried the weight of Father Marcus's secret, unsure whether he was making the right choices, terrified of disappointing the memory of the priest who had entrusted him with such a precious legacy. Now, watching people from all walks of life united in wonder and reverence, he knew he had chosen correctly. "We all did it," he corrected his daughters. "Father Marcus started it. We continued it. And now it belongs to everyone who understands what it means." The weeks following the announcement brought exactly the kind of attention Thomas had expected and prepared for. Reporters from national publications arrived in Millbrook to write feature stories about the discovery. Art historians from universities around the world requested access to study specific pieces. Government officials from several European countries sent diplomatic inquiries about artifacts that might have originated in their territories. But Thomas and his team handled each inquiry with patience and professionalism, guided by the legal frameworks and ethical principles they had spent months developing. More importantly, they had the unwavering support of the local community. The people of Millbrook had watched Thomas restore the cathedral with their own hands and donations. They had seen his commitment to preserving something beautiful for its own sake, not for personal gain. When outside pressure mounted, when lawyers and bureaucrats and treasure hunters began circling, the town rallied around the Sacred Heart Foundation with fierce protectiveness. Mayor Patricia Welch held a press conference, declaring the cathedral and its collection to be a source of immense pride for our entire community. The town council passed a unanimous resolution supporting Thomas's campaign. Efforts to keep the collection intact and accessible. Local businesses donated services and expertise to help with security, maintenance, and visitor management. This isn't just about the treasure, Mayor Welch explained to a reporter from the Washington Post. This is about what Thomas Mitchell and his family have shown us about ourselves. They proved that even a forgotten place like Millbrook can be the guardian of something precious. They reminded us that we're capable of greatness when we work together for something bigger than ourselves. The transformation of Millbrook began subtly but accelerated quickly. The first bus tour arrived just 2 weeks after the announcement. 35 retirees from Philadelphia who had read about the discovery in their church newsletter. They spent the entire day in town, visiting the cathedral, eating at the diner, shopping at the handful of stores that had managed to stay open after the steel mill closed. Within a month, weekend visitors had become common. Serious scholars came to study specific pieces in the collection. Art lovers drove from distant cities to experience something they couldn't find in traditional museums. Religious pilgrims arrived, seeking a deeper connection with artifacts that embodied centuries of faith and devotion. The economic impact was immediate and profound. The Millbrook Diner, which had been struggling to survive on local breakfast customers, suddenly found itself serving lunch to visitors from 3 states. Thompson's hardware store began stocking art supplies and restoration tools for the volunteer craftsmen who wanted to help maintain the cathedral. The abandoned gas station on Route 9 reopened as a combination visitor center and gift shop, selling books about medieval art and postcards featuring images of the cathedral. But the psychological impact was even more significant. For the first time in decades, the people of Millbrook walked with pride instead of resignation. Children who had been planning to leave town after graduation began talking about staying to be part of something important. Elderly residents who had watched their community slowly dying began volunteering at the cathedral, sharing stories about the town's better days with visitors who actually wanted to listen. Emma and Grace experienced their own transformation. The shy, grief-stricken teenagers who had reluctantly followed their father into a crumbling cathedral had become confident young women with a clear sense of purpose and identity. Emma discovered she had a gift for explaining complex historical concepts to visitors of all ages. She developed tour presentations that connected the medieval artifacts to contemporary questions about faith, beauty, and human values. Her favorite moments came when she watched children's faces light up as they understood that the illuminated manuscripts weren't just old books. They were proof that people had always used art to express their deepest beliefs. About love, hope, and transcendence. "I used to think history was just stuff that happened to other people," Emma told Thomas one afternoon, as they walked through the cathedral after closing time. "But working with these artifacts, I see that history is really about the choices people make when they're faced with impossible situations. Father Marcus and the other guardians chose to risk everything to preserve beauty. You chose to share what they preserved, instead of keeping it secret or selling it. Every visitor who comes here chooses to spend their time thinking about something deeper than their daily concerns." Grace had thrown herself into the technical aspects of preservation and security. She learned about climate control systems, conservation techniques, and digital archiving. Her senior project involved creating a comprehensive photographic record of every piece in the collection, complete with detailed condition reports and historical annotations. "I want to be a guardian," she announced during a family dinner in late November. "Not like Father Marcus, hiding things in secret, but like you, Dad, finding ways to protect important things while sharing them with people who can appreciate their value." Thomas looked at his younger daughter, amazed by her maturity and clarity of purpose. At 17, she already understood concepts that many adults never grasped: the difference between ownership and stewardship, between preservation and hoarding, between protecting something and hiding it from the world. The guardians aren't a job, he told her gently. They're a calling. If that's what you choose, you'll spend your life putting the needs of these artifacts above your own convenience, your own comfort, maybe even your own safety. Grace smiled with Sarah's determination. Good. I want my life to matter for something more than just me. The Sacred Heart Foundation officially opened to the public on December 15th, exactly 1 year after Thomas had found Father Marcus's journal. The ceremony was deliberately modest. No ribbon cutting, no speeches from politicians. Just Father Miguel from the local Catholic parish, offering a blessing for the artifacts and the people who would care for them. The first official exhibit, Faith Preserved, Medieval Manuscripts and the Story of Salvation, drew visitors from across the region and received respectful coverage in art magazines and religious publications. But for Thomas, the most meaningful moment came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when he found Mrs. Henderson sitting alone in front of a display case containing a 13th-century illuminated Bible. "You know," she said when she noticed him approaching, "I've been going to church my whole life, but I never really understood what all the fuss was about. Looking at this book, though, you can see how much love went into every page, every letter, every tiny painting. It makes me think, maybe there's something to all this faith business after all." Thomas sat down beside her on one of the wooden benches they had placed throughout the exhibition space. "That's exactly what Father Marcus hoped would happen." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "He spent his whole life taking care of these things, didn't he? Never told anybody, never got any credit, just did what he thought was right, because it needed doing." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "Kind of like what you're doing now." Thomas looked around the exhibition space, the carefully controlled lighting, the security cameras hidden discreetly in the Gothic stonework, the educational materials that helped visitors understand what they were seeing. None of this was about him. It was about creating a space where people could encounter something transcendent, something that connected them to the best impulses of human civilization. "I'm just trying not to disappoint him," Thomas said. Mrs. Henderson patted his arm. "Honey, I think you're doing just fine." As winter gave way to spring, the rhythm of life in Millbrook settled into a new pattern built around the steady stream of visitors to Sacred Heart Cathedral. The town had learned to accommodate tour buses without losing its essential character. Local residents had found ways to share their home with strangers without feeling invaded or exploited. Thomas had grown comfortable in his role as director of the Sacred Heart Foundation, but he remained most at peace during the quiet hours when he could walk through the cathedral alone, checking on the artifacts, reading Father Marcus's journal, and thinking about the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. He often stood in the vault, surrounded by treasures that had survived wars, persecutions, and the simple entropy that claimed most human achievements. Each piece told a story not just of artistic creation, but of faithful preservation people who had recognized something precious and chosen to protect it, even at great personal cost. "We're all guardians now," he said to Emma and Grace one evening as they prepared to close the cathedral for the day. "Everyone who visits, everyone who supports what we're doing, everyone who understands that these artifacts are worth preserving, they're all part of the network Father Marcus helped create." Emma was updating the visitor log, recording the day's attendance and any significant interactions. 47 people today, including a group of art students from the State University and a family from Germany who drove 8 hours just to see the Byzantine collection. Grace was checking the security systems, ensuring that every display case was properly sealed and every camera was functioning correctly. The German family was interesting. The grandfather said his own grandfather had been part of the resistance that helped smuggle artifacts out of occupied territories. He wanted to thank us for keeping that tradition alive. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he thought about the human cost of the Guardian network. So many people had sacrificed so much to preserve these beautiful objects. Father Marcus had spent 60 years in humble service, protecting treasures he could never publicly acknowledge. Now that responsibility belonged to Thomas and his expanding circle of colleagues and supporters, but unlike Father Marcus, Thomas wasn't carrying the burden alone. The Sacred Heart Foundation had grown to include dozens of volunteers, from local residents who served as docents to international scholars who contributed research and expertise. The cathedral had become a focal point for people who understood that preservation was an active choice, not a passive hope. On the second anniversary of his purchase of Sacred Heart Cathedral, Thomas stood in the sanctuary as the late afternoon sun painted the restored windows in brilliant colors. Emma and Grace were in the vault below, leading a special tour for a group of seminarians who were studying the role of art in spiritual formation. The sounds of their voices, serious, enthusiastic, full of purpose, drifted up through the hidden passage like prayers made audible. Thomas thought about the man he had been 2 years earlier, broken by grief, uncertain about his future, struggling to connect with daughters who were drowning in their own pain. He had bought this building in desperation, hoping that shared work might help heal their fractured family. He had never imagined that his dollar investment would yield not just financial security, but a sense of purpose that transformed their understanding of what their lives could mean. The cathedral itself had been transformed as well. Where once there had been peeling paint and broken windows, now there was beauty carefully maintained and lovingly shared. Where once there had been silence and emptiness, now there was the gentle hum of climate control systems, protecting priceless artifacts, and the quiet conversations of people encountering something that expanded their understanding of human possibility. But perhaps the most profound transformation had been in Millbrook itself. The dying steel town had found new life as guardian of an extraordinary cultural treasure. Young people who had been planning to leave after graduation now spoke of staying to be part of something unprecedented. Elderly residents who had watched their community fade into irrelevance now served as ambassadors for a story that connected their small town to the great currents of world history. Anyone can rebuild something broken if they're willing to believe there's still beauty beneath the rust, Thomas said to the empty sanctuary, remembering the words he had written in the visitor's book that morning. As evening approached and the last visitors made their way down the hill toward town, Thomas locked the cathedral doors and walked to his truck. The building rose behind him in the gathering darkness, its Gothic silhouette unchanged since he had first seen it at that awkward auction 18 months ago. But everything else had changed: the building's purpose, the town's future, his own understanding of what it meant to be called to something greater than survival. Thomas drove home through streets where lights glowed in houses that had been dark for years, past the diner, where visitors from distant cities shared tables with local residents, past the hardware store where the owner had posted a sign reading, "Proud supporters of Sacred Heart Cathedral." The town wasn't wealthy, wasn't famous, wasn't destined for greatness in any traditional sense. But it had become something rare and precious, a place where people understood that their highest calling was to protect and share what was beautiful, sacred, and eternal. At home, Emma and Grace were working on college applications, but their essays weren't about escaping Millbrook or pursuing conventional success. They wrote about learning to be guardians of something precious, about discovering that their own lives could be part of a story much larger than themselves. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Grace read aloud from one of the application prompts. Standing in that vault, Emma answered without hesitation, helping people understand that the most important things in life are the ones we preserve for others, not the ones we acquire for ourselves. Thomas smiled as he listened to his daughter's planned futures built around service rather than ambition, preservation rather than acquisition. Sarah would have been proud of the women they were becoming, not because they were successful in any conventional sense, but because they had learned to measure their lives by their contribution to something eternal. As the stars appeared over Millbrook and the lights in Sacred Heart Cathedral glowed softly through its ancient windows, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all to this point. He had started as a desperate widower looking for anything that might help his family heal. He had become the guardian of one of the world's most significant collections of religious art, the director of a foundation that connected thousands of visitors each year with artifacts that embodied humanity's highest aspirations. But more than that, he had discovered that the greatest treasures aren't found in hidden vaults or ancient manuscripts. They're found in the choice to preserve rather than exploit, to share rather than hoard, to build something that will outlast your own brief time on earth. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground and brave enough to believe that broken things still deserve to shine. As morning would soon break over the quiet town of Millbrook, Thomas Mitchell would rise, not as a man merely surviving his grief, but as someone who had learned that the most profound healing comes from dedicating your life to healing something greater than yourself. Because sometimes, the girl who buys a broken cathedral for $1 ends up rebuilding an entire community's faith in the power of beauty, hope, and the courage to protect what the world needs most. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of discovery and transformation await you. Click to continue exploring with us. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones we're meant to share with the world.